In this video, we're going to take a look at Frank Turek's response to a questioner in an audience about the Torah and stoning children.
If the Old Testament law reflects God's character, why do modern sensibilities seemingly, why are they more humane? And the text that comes up a lot is Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21, about a rebellious son being stoned for his rebellion. Seems like something we wouldn't do today. And if the law reflects God's character, why are we so...
Well, first of all, the Old Testament law was never intended to be the ideal law for all time. It was made for a theocratic nation in a situation that there was barbarism all around them. In fact, there's a wonderful book called Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan that goes into all of these things. And he points out the Old Testament law is not the ideal for all time. Now, some aspects of it were, the Ten Commandments, these kind of things. But technically, the Ten Commandments don't apply to us today because they're part of the Old Covenant. When they're repeated in the New Testament, they do apply to us today. But generally, anything from Exodus 20 right through Deuteronomy, that's all the Old Testament. And the writer of Hebrews says the Old Covenant is obsolete, Hebrews 8:13.
Okay, so getting down to the gist of what, first of all, the questioner says. The questioner raises this issue that if the Torah is an expression of God's nature, then how do you reconcile that with the fact that the Torah has many laws which appear to be cruel and barbarous? And certainly the one that the young man highlights is an excellent example, the stoning of children, Deuteronomy 21. And here it's really important that we have a clear grasp and we don't rush over the nature of what we're talking about. Okay, to stone someone to death is to pelt them to death with rocks. This is by any measure a cruel and unusual and inhumane and morally grotesque form of punishment and execution. Just consider if you read today in the news, and this is an example I often will give on this topic. You read in the news that within the Swat Valley of Afghanistan, um, there was a disobedient 17-year-old boy, didn't listen to his parents. So they took him, they had a judgment from the tribal elders, and with the tribal elders, they took him to the city gates. And then what they often do is they bury the person who's going to be stoned up to the waist, and then they begin to throw rocks at them. So they're buried in the ground. They can't move away. They can try to block their head, but that merely prolongs the agony and this torture of the execution. And then people begin to throw rocks at them, including the parents, begin to pelt rocks, throwing hunks of chunks of igneous rock and granite and slate or whatever they can get, hurling them at this child who is bloodied and beaten until they finally succumb to their injuries and die. That is what we are talking about here. Now, this questioner is exactly right. How do you reconcile that with God's perfect command? And Frank Turek's response here is, well, this was never meant to be a perfect law. Okay, but the question isn't why, first of all, why isn't it perfect? The question is, why is it in particular aspects, it's not just imperfect, it appears to be morally grotesque to include what we would today consider to be crimes against humanity, cruel and unusual forms of punishment. So it's not simply that it's not perfect, it's that it appears to be grossly inhumane. How do you reconcile that with the expression of the character of God as being perfect here? Now, another thing I want to point out here is that Turek plays what I'm going to call the accommodation card. And I don't think it's a wrong card to play. I do think we have to recognize there is accommodation in Scripture, that God has accommodated the imperfect understandings of the human authors and the denizens of the worldview of this ancient world in which he revealed himself. But what I think people like Turek often fail to recognize is the degree to which that involves the imputation of actual moral error to those people. For example, if you read Psalm 119, this is a psalm that where the psalmist just revels in the beauty of Torah, in the beauty and wisdom of Torah. There's no sense in Psalm 119 of the psalmist saying, but this is at point point, brutish and was simply an accommodation to the morally imperfect understanding of ancient Near Eastern peoples. On the contrary, the psalmist exults in beauty and wisdom of Torah, including Deuteronomy 21, the stoning of children, pelting children to death with rocks. So when Turek says, well, this is an accommodation to an ancient worldview, he's failing to recognize the degree to which he is really fundamentally disagreeing with the moral assessment of the Torah from biblical authors like the author of Psalm 119.
So all that has been superseded. Now, the situation with stoning children, if you look at this, and you guys know who Dennis Prager is? Dennis Prager is a conservative Jewish man who has a radio program and has written books. He points out that this was actually, and I don't know if I can remember his argument completely, this was actually an improvement to the law at the time, because in order to have a disobedient child killed, you would have to bring them to the elders, and the case would have to be made, right? Without the law, the parent in that culture was able to kill the child without any sort of agreement from anybody else. So this actually protected the child. But remember, in the Old Testament, they're living under the theocratic kingdom.
Okay, so anyway, he gives here now another argument, which is so the first one was an accommodation argument. Now he gives, well, there's a moral improvement here. Okay, moral improvement for what though? So in my other recent video on responding to another aspect of Deuteronomy 21 with respect to Gavin Ortland, where he's arguing that it doesn't allow for rape, I made a point which I want to make here again, which is that just because something is a relative improvement on something else doesn't mean it's not still itself immoral. So in that video, I pointed out that being raped at gunpoint is worse, perhaps all things being equal, in terms of the trauma inflicted on the victim survivor. That's worse than being raped when you're passed out, because you have additional trauma in terms of the experience of the gun and so on. But they're both still morally unconscionable. They're both still rapes. And to say, well, it's not as bad, and it's an improvement to only pelt your children to death with rocks after there's been a judicial proceeding, um, is no improvement. I mean, it's a relative improvement that you have to have a judicial proceeding where you can't just do it extemporaneously. But if the punishment itself is still grossly immoral and a crime against humanity, that doesn't change if there's a judicial proceeding. I mean, imagine if there was a judicial proceeding that was required before you could rape a woman. So you said, well, yeah, it was worse when women could be raped with impunity, but now they can only be raped punitively after there's a judicial proceeding. And you would say, well, yeah, but the ultimate issue, the most basic issue is that rape is grossly immoral. So the fact that you put a judicial proceeding with tribal elders in front of the rape as a hurdle that must be cleared before you can rape the woman punitively for whatever reason is no defense of the act of rape itself. And likewise, putting a judicial proceeding prior to the stoning of a child to death is no moral justification for the act of stoning the child.
Where punishment was greater than it is today, because God is literally Israel's king, whereas today there is no theocracy, there is no theocratic king on the earth today as it was back in, or theocracy as it was back in Israel's time.
I guess my concern is that when people are trying to.
Okay, so the third argument, I guess, that Turek gives here is, well, this was a theocracy and so it was unique. I don't know, this is some kind of odd special pleading red herring, it seems to me. If anything, one would expect that a theocracy where God is directly governing the affairs of the people would be more closely aligned with moral goodness, not less. A theocracy, I would think, all things being equal, is going to be less likely to include crimes against humanity among the judicial punishments, not more likely to include it, but less. And yet here we have Turek saying, well, this is a theocracy, so it included pelting children to death with rocks, which is just sort of a bizarre argument. So here the students now respond, or the young person's responding.
themselves, whether or not God is worthy of love and worship, like someone's question said. They're thinking about a God who would have made a law that way, as that being an extension of his character. Even though it's not in effect today, he did that, and that makes him less credible to them.
Right, but what are they doing when they're saying that? They have a moral standard outside of themselves that they're trying to say God doesn't meet.
Right.
If they're an atheist, they have no moral standard outside themselves.
This person's not an atheist.
Okay, if this person's not an atheist, here is the only legitimate way of saying the God of the Bible is immoral. God does exist, but he's not the God of the Bible. Okay, then make your case about this other God, and what do you do with the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay, I'm going to stop here. This is just nonsense. So first of all, what Turek says here is he plays this argument that he always uses, which, well, if you critique this, these claims that God commanded pelting children to death with rocks, if you critique that, then you must be an atheist and you have no moral standard. Now, first of all, that's just false. There are all sorts of objective moral theories that are non-theistic in terms of they don't have, in fact, of course, going back to the Euthyphro dilemma, there's been a long history of non-theistic philosophers who have argued that you can't fundamentally connect moral obligation to the existence of an agent. It has to exist independently, or moral value has to exist independently of an agent. Now, whether you agree with them or not, those views have existed for centuries. And the fact is, Turek just likes to ignore that they exist and play his caricature that if you're an atheist, somehow you have to be a nihilist. But then you see that this questioner then replies, well, this person isn't an atheist. So then Turek says, oh, okay, then they have to say the God of the Bible is false and they have to argue against the resurrection. No, are you kidding me? There are multiple Christians who reject this claim, and I'm certainly one of them, that God commanded the stoning of children. And if Turek is simply unaware that people exist who disagree with his interpretation of Deuteronomy 21, then he should go back and study and become informed on the fact that there are other people. So this is just a sequence of red herrings. He did nothing to answer this questioner's fundamental question. How do you reconcile the fact that this Torah, this law, which is purporting to show God's perfect will for governing a society as expressed in the voice of Psalm 119, that this is a beautiful and wise law to govern God's people? How do you reconcile that with the fact that it includes what appear to be morally abominable commands, such as the command to pelt children, insubordinate children, to death with rocks? Turek has done nothing to address that objection.